Good afternoon, guys, and welcome back to the Hidebound Convivium. It is October 18th, 2019, and today is sort of a more rambly, a more free-form video where I'm going to talk a little bit about the mission of this channel, what I intend to do with this channel, um, and give some announcements for things going forward. One of the first things I want to say is that I will be moving back to a model of unscheduled content. And this is because between schoolwork, which is about to be picking up towards the end of the fall semester, and other obligations, either to family or church obligations, what have you, I just simply don't have the time to push out the regular 2 videos a week that I wanted to. So, as a result of that, I will be moving back to unscheduled videos. I'm going to try to upload at least once a week, but it may, as you may see, it may be one of these more rambly, more talking from notes episodes. I will go ahead and tell you that I am speaking from notes, so I'll look down at my notes pretty frequently. If that bothers you that I'm not making eye contact with the camera, I'm sorry. And something maybe that I haven't said before, but may get annoying as time goes on in these videos, is that so in my building, I live right next to the door that goes out into the parking lot. So people come and go quite often, and the door is pretty noisy. So it's almost impossible to edit out all the comings and goings from the videos. So you'll just have to bear with me uh, in that regard. Um, So, just to wrap up this sort of introductory section of the video, I'm going back to unscheduled content, but I'm trying to get out a video a week, and they're probably going to be longer. I've played around with OBS a little bit, and I feel a little bit more confident with it, and I feel like I can produce maybe some higher quality videos that go for a longer span of time. But at any rate, we'll go on to the actual meat of this video, which is why I'm making it in the first place. And so I've titled this video My Mission. Um, as some of you may know, given the circles that my viewers swim in, uh, Distributist, Dave the Distributist, he recently put out a series of videos on the eras of YouTube. And this, I don't think I've sat down and really processed everything he said. And it's not the most profound set of videos he's ever made, I think, but it really gave me a think. I think, gave me a think. I think, and I had to sit down, and one of the things I thought about was, what am I actually intending to do with this channel? It's very small, about I think 50 subscribers, and each video averages maybe about 40 to 50 views on YouTube and about the same on BitChute. Um, so, I know that I'm kind of shouting into the void a little bit, or at the very least, my content gets circulated among a small group of people, and frankly, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with just being someone who talks to a particularly small community, because at the end of the day, uh, I'm at the end of the day, I don't really have any desire to be famous or to be some sort of leader or scion of the right wing movement online. I'm just a guy that likes to talk about stuff, and I feel like sometimes I can string two thoughts together that are meaningful and may help some people depending on what their situation is. And I've always said from the beginning of this channel that I wanted to give uh, practical, boots on the ground kind of advice for people in my situation, for people like me who are traditionalists, reactionaries, right wingers, whatever label you want to stick on it. Young people who see what modernity has to offer in the 21st century and reject it and go a different direction. I've tried to do that. I feel like I have done that to some extent in a lot of my videos are focused on practical advice, and I just want to do more of that. Like I just sort of want to renew a focus on that rather than just, my last video, for example, was sort of a really wide angle camera analysis of right wing thought in general. And I like to do that sort of thing. I'm sort of a big picture kind of thinker. So, if my lack of sort of historical or intellectual rigor annoys people, it's just because I'm sort of a big picture kind of person. I like to step back and look at the whole painting in one go. Um, so that's sort of my approach, and I want to bring that sort of big picture analysis approach to practical things that people in my situation can do with their lives. Um, but at the same time, I feel like I need a qualifier of humility, because at the end of the day, I am just a 21-year-old kid. I'm an undergraduate in college. Even though I'm about to graduate, that doesn't necessarily make me an expert in anything. There are much more intelligent people than me out there. There are much more qualified people than me with more credentials. There are people that have seen more of the world than me. So take whatever I have to say with a grain of salt, I guess. But just because I am young, just because I don't have the same experience as other people, doesn't necessarily mean that my input is invaluable, I would say. So, just a qualifier to put out there that I don't think of myself as particularly original, or particularly sort of a particularly intellectual heavyweight within the movement. But one of the things that I feel like my age does allow me to do is it allows me to speak to the specific concerns that people that my age have, people who are 21, 22, and 23 and younger, because this generation is really facing a specific kind of crisis that hasn't been seen in a long time, I think. Part of this goes back to a lot of the trends that we, as right wing YouTube, have been following since 2016. And I can't help but think about my generation as in the similar terms as the generation that sort of came in the last century, the cohort that corresponds to our generation in the last century, and that's the lost generation, the generation that fought in World War I, and the generation that sort of first encountered modernity. And the reason I think about this is because there's a number of catastrophic changes that we can kind of see on the wall coming for coming for the West, and it's going to impact the youth of my generation, probably especially hard, because we're going to be in the middle of it all trying to start out in life. Not to say that it won't impact everyone, just that Generation Z, the Zoomers as people call them, I think will be impacted in a specific kind of way. This is a picture of Ernest Hemingway in Paris in 1920. And if you've ever read some of Hemingway's works, you can tell that he really is, sort of the quintessential modern writer. He's living in a world that is shattered, that he's in all of his stories sort of operate within the pieces of this fragmented world that came about because of the guns of August in 1914 and the disastrous implications of the First World War. I'm not necessarily saying there's going to be a giant war that's going to kill a bunch of young people. That's not what I'm saying necessarily, but there are comparable trends that, just like people could have seen what entangling alliances and increasing militarism and increasing technological innovation was going to do to the powder keg that was the European continent in 1914, I feel like we can also see sort of the same influential factors going forward in the beginning of the 21st century. There's demographic change, obviously, and all of the attendant problems that come along with that. I don't know necessarily how demographic change is going to affect um, the younger generation of people in the Western world. I don't even know necessarily what the effects will be for the society as a whole, but needless to say, it's a stressing factor on the current system. There's also social change. You know, in the time period of the lost generation, this was still very much in their youth. It was a time when divorce was not common, when sort of the reigning Christian social morality was the rule of the day. And my generation of people are really living in the farthest extent of that unraveling um, so far. But as these as demographic changes increase and as political changes increase, we have no idea how that's going to affect the social fabric, and we can see that it could unravel even further, I think, than it currently is. And then, of course, there's political change, and political change. Even though a lot of people write off politics, a lot of people talk about how politicians are controlled, about how voting doesn't matter. What we've really seen since 2016 is we've seen the facade of American democracy slip, and we've seen sort of the inner workings of the machine. And we now understand that these two opposing forces in American life, the sort of the right and the left dichotomy, which is largely mythical, but there is a little bit of truth to this dichotomy. And we know that the forces of progressivism, the forces of antinomianism, the forces of social entropy are quickly eschewing all of the decorum, all of the encrusted traditions of American democracy that sort of kept the two sides in this internal power, this eternal power structure. And we're seeing really both sides attempting to go for the jugular. All the niceties of politics has been stripped away, and now we kind of see the apparatus of power growing underneath. At least that's my read on politics since 2016. I think that's most people's read. When people in the MSM talk about increasing polarization, this is the phenomenon that I think they're talking about. Um, and these larger changes, I don't know how we can fix, really. Um, I don't know how we can fix any of these things, and I fear that just like in the First World War, in its direct aftermath, the young are being led to the slaughter by the old. Now, what do I mean by that? Obviously, I don't mean it in a literal sense, although, you know, things could change and this could become a very literal thing. Um, but really, it's just about this process that's been going on throughout the 20th century and stemming into the 21st of the old sacrificing the young for ideological pet projects, for money, for whatever it happens to be. Really, when people of my age and when people a little bit older than me decry the boomer problem, so to speak, this is really what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the process that started in the First World War, where the older generation, maybe because they didn't understand, maybe because of their pride or vainglory, whatever it may be, they fed the younger generation. In the case of the First World War, they fed them literally into a meat grinder. They killed millions of them. But in our present situation, I'm not sure what form this will take. I just feel like we're moving towards this point where the young are going to have to start paying for the mistakes of the old. It's already happening, I should clarify, but I think we're moving towards a point of increasing violence in this trend, fed by all the things that I just described: the demographic changes, the social changes, and the political changes. I feel like at the end of the day, the real problem with people my age, the real problem with society as it pertains to people my age, is a lack of hope and a lack of faith. One is dependent on the other, specifically. It's very hard to have faith, and without faith, it's very hard to have hope. And the reason that we have these problems is that even for people who are religious like myself, it's very hard to accept the narrative that your religion tells you. So, in my specific instance, Christianity, it's very hard to accept the narrative of Christianity and to take the hope that comes with it. Because, as a point that Distributist made in his video, morality, personal morals, personal achievement doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are cultural forces bearing down on people, and those cultural forces are making faith, in a sense, impossible, and as a result, they're also making hope impossible. Because any true hope, I believe, relies on having faith, and as I would say specifically, having faith in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Other people would disagree, obviously, but every religious system has this narrative structure by which faith in the narrative structure begets hope. But the problem with faith is that it's been under attack basically from everywhere. And in a philosophy class that I'm taking this semester on the problem of evil, uh, which is taught by a gentleman who goes to church with me, I came across, we were reading a text that most people in the philosophy of religion are familiar with. It's David Hume's Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. And one of the things that stuck out to me in this dialogue from the selection that we had in our textbook is, so they're talking about the goodness of God. And Philo in the dialogue is interlocuting with Cleanthes, who is a quote unquote anthropomorphite. He thinks about the attributes of God as being comparable to the attributes in human beings. So God's goodness is like the goodness of men, but it's it's so much more. God is a kind of super good man, if you will. And so this prompts Philo to issue this statement that really you would expect from an empiricist like David Hume, but in this instance, Philo is applying it to God's goodness, but really I think this applies to everything. This is the kind of statement that allows for the breakdown of all the things that faith requires. He says in the dialogues, a mere possible compatibility is not sufficient. So, merely the fact that God could be good in light of the phenomenon that we see in the world isn't sufficient to demonstrate that He is good. You must prove these pure, unmixed, uncontrollable attributes, God's goodness, God's uh, omnipotence, so on and so forth, from the present mixed and confused phenomena, and from these alone. Now, this is a terrible argument, and in class, of course, we broke this down. We looked at all the premises, and we looked how they don't necessarily follow. But I feel like this argument and similar arguments has been sort of a cornerstone of thought in the current, say, in modernity. This idea that it's an empiricist idea, really, that faith, that things that aren't scientific, things that aren't provable by deduction, have no basis in reason. And what this has led to is it's led to a deficiency in, I think, two key areas, two key cultural touchstones that are necessary for the cultivation of faith, and it's led to a particularly fatal third feature which has been a true feature of the modern world since the Enlightenment. And what I intend to do with this channel, circling back to the point of this video, what I intend to do with this channel, my mission in this channel, is to increase the first two and to decrease the prevalence of the third. I intend to cultivate hope and faith by enriching two things: common sense and the realness or the reality of narrative. So what do can I expound upon this? Well, common sense, it's interesting actually. Common sense is very much related to Hume's empiricism. Common sense is the idea that we can trust the immediate experiences of our senses, but not only just our five exterior senses, but also our interior senses. And along with that is a sense of morality. It's very much the C.S. Lewis mere Christianity idea that people do have this common conception of morality. People have this idea that it's wrong for someone to cheat them out of something that they're owed, or it's wrong to, hurt someone. It's wrong to murder. Um, and these are things that are not necessarily demonstrable from, as Hume suggests, these mixed and confused present phenomena. But if you follow Hume's logic, it's just going to lead to solipsism, frankly, because as people might have pointed out, Hume's argument is sort of self-refuting. It's impossible to demonstrate empiricism from empiricism, but it's done its damage. Common sense and this common, this naive, commonsensical idea of reality has really been in the modern world dealt a death blow by this kind of acidic principle, like what you see in David Hume. Another thing that specifically modernism and postmodernism have done is to deconstruct the idea of the realness of narrative. So, narrative is just a story. And the thing about narratives is they could not possibly contain the wholeness of whatever experience they're describing, whether it's a fictional account or a rendering of something that happened historically. And the real contention revolves around the second class of narratives. So if you take a Shakespeare play, for example, Shakespeare leaned very heavily on the historiography of his time period to write things like say King Henry IV, Part 1 and Part 2. And so we can't expect necessarily that he would tell a story that is, as we understand it, historically accurate, because that's not the style of historiography at the time. Frankly, because people at the time understood that any narrative, whether it pretends to be historically accurate or not, cannot encompass the wholeness of the thing that it's describing. Does that make it untrue? No. There's a difference, of course, between a narrative that doesn't encompass the entirety of whatever it's describing and a narrative that is fallacious. I'll give you a good example. So if you pick up the Gospel of St. John, and if you turn to the very end of St. John, chapter 21, verses 24 and 25, it reads that this is that disciple who giveth testimony of these things, and hath written these things, and we know that this testimony is true. But there are also many other things which Jesus did, which, if they were written every one, the world itself, I think, would not be able to contain the books that should be written. Well, what is that? Let's pick apart the end of St. John there. What St. John is saying is the common sense understanding that I feel like everybody up until, some random point in the recent past thought about narratives, stories. They can't possibly encompass, as St. John said, if you were to encompass everything that Jesus did, you couldn't possibly write enough books to contain the life of Jesus. And now, you know, Jesus is a particularly interesting example, of course, because, well, Son of God. But just take any person's life, for example. It could be a famous person, Julius Caesar, for example, or it could be me. You could fill up volumes and volumes with every single detail of our lives, and at no point would we have scientia. At no point would we have perfect knowledge of all the details that occurred in the span of time that the narrative purports to encompass. Does this make the narrative fallacious? No. Uh, there's a difference, of course. A fallacious narrative is one in which you experience the narrative and you draw the wrong conclusions about whatever it was that it's describing. So you take, for example, historiography of England that involves King Arthur, and very often these historiographies went very much off the rails and talked about King Arthur subduing all of Europe. And this obviously did not happen. It's a fallacious rendering of history. But if you take something like King Henry IV, is it accurate in all its details about the life of King Henry? No. Is it intended to be? No. It's a narrative that gives one sliver of what it was like in the life of King Henry IV, and it gives you the texture of the life of King Henry IV, and it lets it rattle around in your rib cage there, like every good narrative should rattle around in the heart. And so these two-pronged attacks, say, by empiricism on the nature of common sense, on the nature of common morality, and then the attack by postmodern theory and theories of narrative on the grand overarching narratives of the West, have left us in a very impoverished position, have given us a garden wherein the flower of faith grows very difficult, with great difficulty, I should say. And it's also begat a monster that attacks both of these things simultaneously, something I call very cheekily lab coat occultism. And so the granddaddy of lab coat occultism is the theory of evolution, in my opinion. There are so many of these just so stories about that govern the scientific worldview that are designed specifically to attack both of these common sense understandings of reality and of the narratives that help us make sense of reality. So evolution obviously attacks sort of religious conceptions of origins, and something like, say, quantum mechanics as it's generally presented to lay people attacks the idea that our sensory perceptions of the world can be trusted. Now, personally, I'm sort of rather agnostic about the theory of evolution, the age of the Earth, all of these hot button sort of questions about origins, questions about the distant past. I don't think they are interesting in a sense, but I don't think they're interesting in the way that a lot of people think that they're interesting. I think Darwinian evolution doesn't have the kind of explanatory power that people think it does. It isn't the monolithic explanation for all of biological history that people think it is. People merely follow this assumption because of the way that it is presented to lay people. That doesn't necessarily mean that competing theories of biological history are any better. It just necessarily means that perhaps we should take with a grain of salt people who proclaim to know by reason of deduction what happened 4 billion years ago. It's a very strong claim, and if you really look at the scientific literature, it doesn't seem supportable, I think. And it's these kinds of just so stories, these kinds of religious fables that are built up with the intent to corrode uh, common sense and to corrode our understanding of narrative reality. Um, it's just these sort of stories that need to be looked at with a skeptical eye and perhaps dispelled. We shouldn't shy away from this, because if we were truly to believe our faith, then we would believe that truth cannot conflict with truth, as, for example, C.S. Lewis might say. And if we find truly that truth does conflict with truth, then we should re examine our premises. And I don't mean this in the sort of in the sort of way that, say, a young earth creationist might mean this, where they completely miss the plot and they read into biblical literature things that are not there, things that were not left by the writers, things that were not given by the Holy Spirit for us to know. Merely, we should, regard with a detached view, maybe a more big picture view, issues regarding the scientific worldview. And the first thing that comes to mind for me when talking about this is a talk that I heard not too long ago by Jonathan Peugeot, who I admire for his takes on a lot of these things. And he gave a talk about the Copernican revolution. Now, the Copernican revolution was, in a sense, a sort of sea change in the way that people thought about the world. The sun being at the center of the cosmos changed a lot of things about the way people thought about the narratives that they had been told about the world. But as Peugeot sort of expresses in that video, is that disenchantment is all about the frame game. And there's a clear cut example that sort of channels the same sort of, this is related to the same sort of topic. And this is about space. Space, you knew I was going to tie this to astronomy somehow. Space, and this pun is completely intentional, is a mythical space. It doesn't exist in the way scientists think it does, I think. It's unfathomably vast. It's beautiful. It's filled with the strangest phenomena imaginable, things that we could not have dreamed of, before the invention of high-powered telescopes. There are forces of nature that mortals cannot contend with, some that we can't even understand. And there are reaches of the cosmos that mortals could never hope to reach in a billion years. All of this combined with its intense beauty. I mean, this is what I've got on the screen right here is an artist's rendition of the surface of Europa. And I could not imagine the kinds of vistas that stretch across the whole of the cosmos. And that demonstrates why we still call the night sky the heavens. And we see it as empty only because we have impoverished faculties. And what other playground could possibly contain the winged seraphim, those frightful, awful servants of an unfathomable God? And so, like I said, it's all about the frame. And it is, in a sense, all about perspective. Just in the same way that Jonathan Peugeot talks about how after the Copernican revolution and this idea of decentering man, of decentering the earth, didn't really make a lot of sense, because at the end of the day, all experiences are related to and centered on the experiencer situated on Earth. In a similar way, the disenchantment that we're experiencing is all about framing. So apply this to what we've been talking about, to these scientific narratives, and apply a little bit of humility, a little bit of skepticism about the power of lab coat religion. What do we really know about the incalculable mists of time? We don't really know what happened. We can't really form good conjectures about what happened. We can form broad outlines maybe, but we can't fill in the details from what we have available to us. And I don't mean to say that we can't sort of scientifically think about things that happened in the past. I'm just saying that the past is so vast and it's so shrouded in so many layers of understanding that human beings don't have the faculties to peel back, that we should be skeptical about the way that the past is used to deconstruct narratives. So, what reasons have we to suspect that the past was not an enchanted past? In a similar way, what reason do we have to expect that the present is not an enchanted present? Isn't it enchanted now? If you're a Catholic like me, then you believe in things like the miracle of the sun at Fatima. You believe in things like the incorruptible relics of the saints. You believe in things like the Shroud of Turin. You believe in things like you know, relics of the saints that have effects in this world. You believe in enchanted things, or you should. And as I've demonstrated, this ability to poison, in a sense, the garden in which faith grows is based on argumentation and based on conjectures that are largely leading us to solipsism, leading us to insanity. What reason have we to suspect that men, that beasts, that plants, worlds are automata, that there is no assembling principle to life, that there is no direction in which we are all leaning towards? There is no teleology to anything. When we see and we feel clearly with that interior sense, that common sense or common morality, that faculty that governs those things, the pneuma of man, the soul, and we grasp that there is something that is an organizing principle of the matter in front of us, which we call a man. And in order to recapture that, we have to recapture many different things. But as I've stated earlier in the video, I think the two key things are a fundamental trust of our sensory abilities, a fundamental trust not only of the five senses but of our interior senses, and an understanding of narrative, an understanding of the reality of narrative and how it functions. But more on that anon. I understand this was probably a little bit of a ramble, probably undue repetition towards the end, but hopefully that outlines the direction that I want to take this channel. It outlines the sort of things that I want to talk about, and hopefully this will open myself up to greater criticism. Will open myself up to people who want to join me in this sort of project and in critiquing my understanding of the situation. But distribute this video really put me in a contemplative mood. And so I think by reaffirming the mission of this channel, I'll have given a greater focus to my work, which I hope to be continuing to a greater extent in the future. But until then, this has been the Hidebound Convivium. God bless and good day.